I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernko.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Dean, hark! It's time for an episode about angels. Are you ready for it? Are you ready for all these angels that we're about to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, the hark was startling, but it really got my attention.
Good, because it's supposed to. That's why angels say hark, so they get your attention. So you know that you're about to be angelified.
Yeah, you've been harked.
You've been harked, and we're going to keep bringing you messages throughout this entire episode, just like angels do. Folks, it's time for an episode of the Magnificast about angels. As students of the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism, we're not very good students. We're maybe like, I don't know, I'm a D student for sure about Marxism-Leninism. But we don't talk about the metaphysical very often for a lot of reasons, because it's uncomfortable. It's weird. We don't like it. Maybe I do like it sometimes, but it's complicated to say the least, right?
It is complicated. What's going on up there? Nobody knows. Theologians have spent millennia trying to figure out how many angels can fit on the top of a pin, and guess what? I don't even know.
I wish they would just figure it out. Just give me a new number. Every year, come out with a new number. It's fine. That's why you can keep your textbooks, circulating and into the classrooms. Oh, this year we've got 300 angels on this pinhead.
Yeah, they could just tell me it's like 38 or something, and I would take their word for it.
I wouldn't question it whatsoever. If a theologian tells me something, I definitely believe it every time.
I can't believe you're not Roman Catholic.
It's hard to believe, actually. Thinking about the supernatural side of Christianity is, I don't know, confusing. I don't know what to do with any of it. I don't know. I could say more, but I won't. But this week, we're eschewing all of that. We're throwing it all off because we're going to bring you a hot episode with a materialistic reading of angels from perhaps one of the most niche French philosophers called Michel Serres. And he has a book called Angels. So we're going to talk about it. You know us, Dean and I, we have read too much philosophy for our own good, and we love these wacky French guys. And especially sort of like turn of the century, postmodern kind of guys. They're great. And Michel Serres definitely falls into that category in one way or the other. Well, he's definitely a character in French philosophy that you probably wouldn't come across in your undergraduate philosophy class unless you have a really mean teacher. So we're going to talk about Michel Serres and his book on angels. Dean, let's talk about Michel Serres before we talk about angels, though. This guy, he's great.
Yeah, he's great. Longtime listeners of the Magnificast will remember that we used to want to talk a lot about this guy named Paul Virilio, a weird French philosopher who talked a lot about technology, and he's a very interesting character. He's kind of in the mix. We've also talked about Bruno Latour on this show, so Sarah's kind of in that big group of French people talking about philosophy, science, and religion in the weirdest ways that you can imagine, and Sarah has his own particularly weird way of doing it. He tells a lot of stories. He talks a lot about sociology, but in a way that you wouldn't think that he's talking about sociology until it's too late. All of a sudden you're stuck. You're talking about it. You didn't even know. His big strategy is to really, I think, reel you in with the scene or the fable and then get your brain working. And I really like that a lot. A lot of other French philosophers are kind of a pain to read. And Sarah's also a bit of a pain, but like he at least is somebody who can like help you have a little bit of fun as you go through it.
Yeah, totally. Grouping him in with Bruno Latour and Paul Virilio is exactly right. He's a bit younger than Latour, but Sarah and Latour are like collaborators in some capacity. Let's see. Well, Michel Serres, he's now passed. He died in 2019, so very recently. But he's one of those French philosophers that kind of comes out of the horrors of World War II and being in a fascist occupied country. I read an interview with Michel Serres that Bruno Latour actually conducted, and Serres in it said that he was 6 when he saw his first dead bodies, which is like a formative event, I think, for anybody. But what's interesting though is I think this isn't like 100% true. And not saying Michel Serres is not like a critical person or that he doesn't have some like teeth to his work, because he definitely does. But he is not as pessimistic, I think, as some other French philosophers of the same era.
Yeah.
Like, Baudrillard or Paul Virilio, they have like, some hard walls that they cannot get over. Where Michel Serres is, I don't know if hopeful is the right word, but he's definitely having more fun with it. And that's cool, I think. There's a book that he wrote that is not the one we're talking about, but it's called Thumbelina. And it's like a book that he wrote. So it's a book he wrote about technology, but it's written to millennials is like the pitch of the book. And I love it because it's just like technology is really changing a lot of things. I hope you guys have a good time with it. And like, that's kind of it. It's not like warning you that it's going to make you stupid or something. It's not like telling you the end of the world is coming. It's just telling you that you're going to be different people. And that's pretty weird. And he's right. And I like it.
Yeah, that's a good counterpoint, right? Because someone like Paul Virilio is going to tell you technology is changing you, and it is also the end of the world, and you should try to get out like while you still can, right? That you get the apocalypticism with somebody like Virilio, and maybe even worse with Baudrillard, because guess what? It's the apocalypse, and you can't get out, and all you can do is like watch it on TV while it happens to you. What a big bummer. Michel Serres is great because there is a playfulness there, and he does, like you said, he does have his critical moments. In fact, in this book, he has some really interesting things to say that could have come right out of a Paul Virilio book on cities and so on, but he definitely isn't that way on the whole, and I can appreciate that. Another thing that's kind of interesting about Serres is that he talks a lot about religion, and I think it's unusual that he's kind of on the B squad of postmodern philosophers from France. Everybody knows Derrida. We all know Foucault. Some of us know Deleuze, these kinds of people. Serres is maybe a little bit lower on that list of familiarity for Christians, especially, which I find really bizarre because in the early mid-2000s, there was this kind of like small publishing industry of Christians talking about postmodern philosophy. And weirdly, they never talked about the Christian ones. Like, they never talked about the ones who really are going out of their way to say something about religion, like Virilio or like Latour, and in particular, Michel Serres. I feel like everywhere you look in Serres' work, there's like, in every book I've ever read by him, there's at least one extremely wild example taken from theology or religious history or something, and he himself is invested in the Catholic Church. So it's weird that, like, you never got a James K. Smith book about bringing Michel Serres to church, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe we dodged a bullet. Who could say? But it's interesting to me that he never really got drawn into that Christian orbit. So maybe that's also why I'm really interested in what he's doing, because it feels like a guy more people should have paid attention to and didn't. And now it's like an anachronistic interest, maybe in some way, but
Yeah.
but a pretty cool guy to read.
Yeah, I agree. A very cool guy to read. I actually think that it's not that anachronistic an interest. I think that Michel Serres still has a lot of things to say to people.
Yeah.
We'll talk about those in just a minute. We're going to talk about angels. I promise. I swear to God, this is not all about French philosophy, though it's like mostly about French philosophy. But it's important that people kind of get a feel for like what this dude is about before we get into the angel conversation. Because if you don't, you're going to be let down. So I've written a blurb trying to encapsulate a little bit about what Michel Serres is about, and I'm going to just kind of try to explain it. Is that okay, Dean? I hope it works.
Yeah, I can't wait to learn.
Okay. So Michel Serres, he's interesting for all kinds of reasons that we've talked about already, right? He's Catholic, he's French, things that we love. I mean, not the French part. I could take or leave them, but but French philosophers, I like them for some very weird reason. So he's Catholic in a really interesting way. He has a lot to say about lots of Catholic theology. It comes out in his work. You can't, if you read him and then you know he's Catholic, it all makes sense. It clicks into place for sure. Actually, just today I was sharing a quote from Michel Serres about gay marriage and the Holy Family in the Discord, the Magnificast Discord, which you can join if you subscribe to our Patreon at $1 or more. And anyways, it all made sense to everyone as soon as I posted it. Okay. Anyways, a great organic marketing plug. He's Catholic in an interesting way, and it comes out in his work, and you're gonna feel it for sure in this episode. He engages with lots of theology and other types of religious philosophy. He's extremely interested in like lots of like Greek mythic figures. Hermes, Hercules, all these guys, they're in there. All your favorite Disney characters, they're all in the mix. But surprisingly, perhaps, he's not like a philosopher of religion. He's not a sociologist of religion. He is a philosopher of science, or a sociologist of science. People in all kinds of those like science and technology studies, in those types of like academic discourses are kind of interested in Serres for a few different reasons. So what makes Serres a really unique thinker, philosopher, sociologist, and so on, is that he's always trying to explore scientific topics, sociological topics, these like big ideas that were handed by science. But he's doing it through the access that non-scientific language grants, rather than like a universal or like objective, quote unquote, type of language. So instead of talking about sociological things or whatever, he'll talk about a weird fable or a weird story or a weird French game. So, for example, one of Serres' most famous books, I think, is called Parasite. And in it, he describes a really complex sociological relationship between in-groups and out-groups, but it's all done through this like extended fable through this long-ass book about city rats and country rats and who gets to eat first and all of this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, you've seen the movie. It was a great interpretation for sure.
For sure. This is 5 Goes West or something. I don't know. But what's neat about this book, Parasite, is that he concludes something really interesting that I think is like a pretty deep sociological insight that you would find maybe not in a book about rats. And that is that like minority groups and all human groups fundamentally share a parasitic relationship with some larger host. And these minority groups, however they might manifest, can make themselves felt within the relationship of parasite and host by becoming a problem for other people. Like biting you a little bit too hard, sucking your blood. I mean, you can see how that might sound like a negative connotation, but he tackles this in the book, and it's this whole thing. Anyways, it's a really cool book, and if you want to read something bizarre, this is for you.
Important to point out maybe that, Parasite, just to double down, is not a negative attribute for Serres. So he's not being like minorities are parasites in a bad way or a kind of like fashy way, right? Instead, he's trying to get at something interesting with that term, and you have to read the whole book to figure it out. But just want to flag that here so you don't go away from this podcast being like, Michel Serres thinks that minorities are, sucking off the system or whatever. It's not a right-wing talking point.
No, for sure, it's not. He's talking about it in a different register. Humans in general are parasites off the earth,
right?
But in sometimes a good way, sometimes a bad way. Mostly a bad way. Anyways, one of the other like pretty consistent themes of Serres' work is thinking of non-human entities like the climate, weather, nature, animals, and even like technological devices and objects as being actors in relationship to humans and alongside humans. And another of Serres' well-known works is called, kind of on the same point, is called The Natural Contract. And through a series of very complicated explanations of like paintings and poems and parables and stories, this is how all his work always goes. Serres argues that there's like just like that there's a social contract between humans, that there should also be like a natural contract between humans and nature, which is interesting. The book opens with this like description of this painting of these two people fighting as they're sinking into the mud, and like that's kind of the relationship that he sees. and we should just stop sinking into the mud. Is kind of is the moral of the story. So Michel Serres, he takes on all these kinds of like weird and unusual subjects to get at a fundamentally interesting observation about the world, about some kind of like scientific idea or so on, right? But the challenge with Sarah is that he's like notoriously reliant on French idioms and French examples, making him extremely hard to translate into English. So he'll often reference some kind of like French joke or French historical event or place or like a French childhood game. And you'll have to spend, like an hour down the rabbit hole trying to research about how, what this has to do with what he's talking about. And it's like a deep hole that you'll fall into. For example, in the book Parasite, there's this particular philosophical idea that we'll talk about here in a little bit called the quasi-object, which I love a new philosophical term. It's one of my favorite things. I love when people just make up shit. It's great. But to get to the bottom of this particular idea, he talks about this French game called like it's called the ferret, and it's kind of like it's like a who's got the button kind of game where you're trying to pass around this like toy ferret, I think. And anyways, it doesn't matter. But he'll do something like that every single time. And it's like something that should be straightforward and understandable, like, oh, trying to make this make sense to people. It's like this game that everyone plays when they're children, but if you're not French, you'll never get it. So there's always like an extended footnote that's trying to explain like what is going on with this like ferret game. And anyways, that's how you can spend a lot of your time as a grad student if you feel like it. Reading
We'll play it at
French
we'll play it at the Magnificast Christmas party. Pass the ferret game. And
great.
if you lose, you have to read Michel Serres.
Yikes! I gotta win. I can't go back to this. I just did my time once again. My monthly or yearly Michel Serres penance. Okay, Dean, is there anything else we're missing out on before we jump into talking about angels?
I think that is just about it. I guess one other piece. So we're going to talk about angels. He wrote this whole book about angels, and it's really fun. It's very weird. And it is, I don't know, if you like this piece, it's reflective of some of the other tendencies that you get in Serres, which is that strange engagement with the Christian tradition. For example, I'm pretty sure it's in Thumbelina, there is also this image of the cephalophore, which are Christian saints who don't have heads, or their heads got cut off and they like carry their heads around. Saint Denis is one of the most famous cephalophores, but they you've probably seen a picture of them here or there, or I don't know, you can Google them and see them. But basically, they're kind of like headless horseman statues. So it'll be a saint, and the saint is like holding his or her head, next to them at their waist or whatever. And Michel Serres will draw on that image to be like, oh, what an interesting thing. This is a saint. It's this kind of evocative statue, right? What does it tell us about all these different ways that we relate to our bodies and so on? And that's like exactly what we're doing with our smartphones. We're all becoming cephalophores, and he'll kind of tease out the metaphor in these really interesting, complicated ways. And I feel like the thing that maybe drives people to love or hate Serres is that he pushes the metaphor as hard as it can to the point of breaking, and then just keeps on going with it. Like, it's all very lyrical, very over the top, but I think that's my favorite part about it. And I love that he does so much with the Christian tradition that way. So if you ever just want to like have a weird opinion about something like cephalophores and your smartphones, Serres is your guy. You'll find all kinds of extremely weird things that you can show up at a party and be like, have you ever thought about this? And that's basically all it's good for, but it's pretty good for that.
I love that example about the cephalophores is so great because it's almost, okay, saying that he's pushing a metaphor to its breaking point is like one way of putting it. But I think in another way, Michel Serres is like extremely not metaphoric. Like, he will take a religious idea like the cephalophore, and he'll be like, and that's just how things are.
That's right.
Just like Saint Denis, you're walking around with your head detached in your hands, and you're just you're thinking with your phone and not with your brain. And there you go. I don't know. I mean, either way you look at it, I feel like he takes these things and he makes them extremely literal in ways that I think you get a lot of like mileage out of when you start engaging with it.
Yeah, so that is a great transition into this book, because that is exactly what Michel Serres is doing in the book. It's called Angels, A Modern Myth. and he is taking angels as seriously as a person can take them. So you can think about medieval society. They're also kind of doing this in a funny way, trying to figure out how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. But they're almost like getting, they're making it too complicated. Michel Serres is like, it's so easy. Angels, fundamentally, the one thing you got to know about them is that they are messengers. And that's basically it. There's all kinds of other stuff. Michel Serres loves to talk about wings and what they are, and angel hierarchies and all that kind of stuff. Jacob's ladder. Anything that anyone has ever said about angels, you can find Michel Serres referencing it in the book. But the key is that they're messengers, and that's the big piece. And the way that he sort of starts the book, I think, is already kind of suggestive. So the book, it's like a kind of almost like a Platonic dialogue, right? If you've ever read Plato writing about Socrates, and he's developing his philosophy with Socrates talking with all these other people, kind of like it's a play. Michel Serres is doing the same thing. And in his scene, there's two characters who are talking at an airport, which is a really suggestive place for a book about messengers and angels and so on. And he starts with one of the characters saying, "Angels are legendary beings. I don't know whether I believe in them or not. But how else are we to read and understand these sounds in this hurly-burly world where nobody actually lives and everyone's just speeding through?" The other person replies, "I have an idea that you're using the word legend, like the legend that map makers put under maps. The key that you have to study in order to read them. Am I right?" "Yes," the other person says. "Yes, Socrates, exactly." You get this kind of sense, right, that there's something that's kind of a key about the idea of angels, about who they are as kind of, metaphysical beings. They're not quite human. They're not quite God. They're somewhere in between. They're sort of virtual, like they're always also speeding around the ancient world. They're appearing to people. They're giving them messages from God. They're these intermediary figures, right? They're not God. They don't have a message themselves necessarily. They're just kind of delivering it here. And there's something about that function that tells us something that can help us find our way in the bizarre world of air transportation and communications technologies, and our own ability as humans in a postmodern or information society or whatever, our own ability to kind of be everywhere all at once. And I think that is actually pretty fun and a great premise for a way of investigating postmodern society.
Totally. So the thing I said earlier about how Sarah engages with these particular, like, maybe myths. I mean, it's the word myths is the word that he uses. Fables, stories, legendary characters, like angels, is that it gives you access to thinking about our particular, like, technological situation in ways that, maybe you wouldn't otherwise, right? Like, you could talk about instantaneous communication between people in a really straightforward way. And there's particular things that gets you, right? Like, you can talk about the miles of underwater cable that connect us to one another and, like, makes those types of communication possible. Or you can talk about the copper that you need for those cables, and in that register too, you get a different type of conversation. You can talk about it phenomenologically, about how weird it is that you can be in one time zone and talk to somebody who is across the world, instantaneously, and they are already in tomorrow, right? Because of the time difference or whatever. And all those ways of talking about the world can be interesting and helpful and fruitful. But there's something that is like, but what Michel Serres wants to do in his work is try to say, like, none of those ways of talking about the world are necessarily exhaustive, nor are they objective in the meta-narrative sense, right? That they're not ever telling the whole story, that there's always something kind of left out of the story. And Michel Serres' like work is always finding something that is left out that he's going to just kind of push into it in some way, right? And make you consider this whole different thing. So anyways, so when you're talking about instantaneous communication, you're talking about, like, how people can travel around the world extremely quickly and so on. He thinks that is actually, like, it is formally, it carries the tropes of the angelic form of a being that can just show up and reveal something to you. And I think that's kind of right. I don't know. It's funny because what I like about this very first sentence too here is that he does this thing that I think is actually really fun, where he says, we live in this, like, extremely technological world that has all of these, technological aspects to it, and you have to know all of the ins and outs of these different systems to really understand it. But it's like at the end of the day, like when you send a text message to somebody and it does appear on their screen within like, a tenth of a second or something, or maybe a little more, who knows? I don't actually know. It's actually pretty magical in your experience. So like, I don't know. Is it angelic? Like kind of, right? It's not that far removed. Like the average person, even me, a person who studies media and technology for a long time, I don't really know how it works in any specificity. And anytime I tell a story about it, it's always kind of like telling a piece of the story. So I don't know. Why not get wild with it? Why not see what this affords you to talk about it in this more religious and theological register than, I don't know, other metaphors, other language.
Yeah. And what is also interesting is so angels reveal something about the technology, right? They tell us something about, like you said, what it's like to be able to talk to somebody in a different time zone, and it gives you a certain valence on talking about that. It also works in a sort of recursive way where the world in which we live also tells us something about angels, which is really fun. There's a lot of different conversations that are opened up throughout the book around stories about angels. For example, like Jacob's ladder in the Bible, right? The angels kind of walking up and down from heaven. Sarah has a great riff on that image where he's kind of talking about communications technologies that give us a way to sort of become like closer and further away from God, further and closer away from ourselves. But you also learn a lot about angels in that exchange, that angels are the ones who are kind of mediating between God and creation in these interesting ways. And I think that is probably a pretty under theologized thing as well. I don't know if you're a person out there looking for a master's thesis or whatever, you could definitely do one on the implicit theology of Michel Serres. There's a long tradition of Christians thinking about a subject like angels, and looking into Aristotelian philosophy and other kinds of philosophical languages to make sense of these beings that appear in the biblical story. But what I really like about Michel Serres, he's kind of doing that, except like his touch point isn't Aristotle. It's like, I don't know, whoever else he's reading in the 20th century in France. He's trying to sort of, it's not like he's creating a theology of angels in the same way that like Thomas Aquinas is doing that, but he is using the philosophical tools of his day to talk about angels in the same way that Aquinas is doing that, using the tools of his day to talk about angels. Totally. So I think there's something really fun there for Christians as well to be like, yeah, what does it mean to be a person living in this society thinking about, these weird historical literary figures?
Yeah, that's right. This is a book about a lot of things for sure, but it is undeniably metaphysics. And I don't know. You can't get around that. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and we'll get to some of the other bits here in a minute. But fundamentally, the angelic sort of form, right, is something that for Sarah comes down to fluxes, which is an unhelpful word, I think. But let me read a little passage from this, and we can talk through more about like what's happening here. So there's the angel as messenger, right? And we can talk about that in terms of I was just using text messages as an example, or emails or whatever. People bringing messages to one another, or people getting on an airplane and like literally flying to another place to talk to somebody else. That's messenger behavior. That's big messenger energy.
The BME for sure.
Yeah, but these types of like exchanges or carrying, I guess, they happen in other contexts as well, and in a lot broader types of situations. So this is a bit from this conversation, again, between these two imaginary people that Michel Serres puts in an airport. So one person says to the other, just to please you, instead of angels, I'll call them intermediaries or messengers. No system without things being transmitted. The other person responds, so no world without wind. No world without all the fluxes interacting. Pia, that's the other person, with an air of sensuality. I love swimming in the rivers, the caress of gentle breeze, gentle sunshine, and the feeling of fluid earth in the mud bath, the four elements in movement. P, the other person, with a professional air, could we perhaps use one word to describe all these bearers of messages, of movements, and so on. Wind creates flows of air in the atmosphere. Rivers make flows of water across land. glaciers make solid rivers, cutting their way across mountains and valleys. Rain, snow, and hail are flows of water through air. Marine currents are flows of water within water. Volcanoes are vertical flows of fire from earth into the air or into the sea. Lava flows and mud flows are liquid earth, respectively hot and cold, moving across land, and drifting continents are moving carpets of land floating on fire, right at the heart of the earth. Scientists have identified flows of fire within its subterranean fire, and up in the atmosphere and out in space, fluxes of heat and light. So I'm reading this piece because I think that the bigger picture is necessary, right? The angelic form, I think, is not just human, but it's also has a lot to do with nature. It's about one thing moving to another place, and there's a distinction here that Michel Serres is going to make that I think is really interesting. That meaning, intention, communication isn't solely a human thing, or isn't solely a divine. I mean, maybe it is divine in like the big picture, but it's not just something that humans do, right? Whenever one thing is carrying to another place, Michel Serres thinks that's sort of the form, the angelic form, right? You're doing the work of angel to mediate one thing to another place, and Serres thinks that it's not just humans that do that. It's like all of these different things. It's lava underground. It's the continents drifting and so on. And I'll say he is he's against anthropomorphism. He's against like the whole idea that humans are somehow special in creation. He thinks a lot about non-humans and like how how we can listen to them, how we can like kind of come into an understanding of the world that pays attention to things that aren't human, in a really serious way, in a way that really interrogates knowing beyond just like scientific data.
Yeah, and he goes on to add to that, I think, in ways that pull that out. He says, working through a combination of fire, air, and water, these flows bring the news of Alice Springs to sign or origine. I admit that the coded message isn't exactly easy to decipher, but we're beginning to crack it. As the wind hits Cape Joburg, it informs the first French person it meets about events that are happening in Florida and Australia. To which the other person says, come to think of it, less of a letdown. I can already see the angels there. Wind is a messenger that may be good or bad, or a giver or a stealer, chubby pooty or devils incarnate. Thanks to the wind, any of those places that you just mentioned echo with the totality of space. One breeze bears and announces the whole universe. Each flux breaks down into myriad single particles, but they all go to make up the world. Each of them bears little bits, which, when put together, make the larger whole. And I think that is also a really interesting thing. We live in an information society. That's kind of one way of talking about the revolution of information technologies, Google and the internet and cell phones and satellites and all that kind of stuff. But what I think is so fascinating is Michel Serres is like, well, we've kind of always been living in an information technology because everything is bearing some kind of information, right? Humans are creatures who can read things in the world in bizarre sorts of ways. I think that there's actually a lot going on there with Serres' work on hermeneutics and what it means to kind of develop a philosophy of reading or interpretation and that sort of thing. And he's applying that to the world around us in such a way that, yeah, the breeze can be an angel insofar as it brings you some kind of information. You might need an instrument to detect what that information is. You might have to be like a weather person or something. You need the Doppler radar to figure out what's coming and how to read the signs. But fundamentally, there is this angelic function that even creation plays. And I think that materialization of angels is actually a really fun bringing together of like the sacred and the profane in Serres' work.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly right. Let me add one more piece here, I think,
Sure.
to kind of push the point that Serres is making. So the conversation in this airport continues, and one of the people in this conversation is a little bit skeptical. I think about this whole thing, right? Not antagonistically so, just a little bit. So the person answers this whole explanation of like angels and fluxes in circulation and so on, like this. If winds, currents, glaciers, volcanoes, etc. carry subtle messages that are so difficult to read that it takes us absolutely ages trying to decipher them, wouldn't it be appropriate to call them intelligent? What human could ever presume to speak a language that was so precise, refined, and exquisitely coded? And then the other person answers, don't you think it's rather arrogant of us to assume that we're the only intelligent beings in this world when the river Garonne and the south wind carry with them and express more things than I could ever be able to write and express them better? They read instantaneously the messages of other fluxes, filter them and make their choice, combine them with their own, translate them and write them on land or water. They conserve them for a long time. They express themselves through explosions, roarings, noise, and murmurings, tinkling and lapping. The movement of these fluxes need nothing to inspire them because they are the inspiration. And then the other person responds, this is the last part, I promise. They say, how would it be if it turned out that we were only the slowest and least intelligent beings in the world? Tradition says that above us, there are angels. Okay, I think this is great though, because it does take extremely seriously the metaphysics that they're setting up. And it does, I think, it pulls something out about nature that I think people don't think very often. What if the Earth? I mean, you hear about things like the Gaia hypothesis, even from like theologians like Boff or whatever, right? Or you'll hear even people like I don't know. Sometimes you hear like stuff in environmental spaces where people will be like, the Earth is a living organism or whatever, and it's never really clear exactly what people mean by those things. But in this example, Sarah thinks that the Earth is not just a living organism, but it's a lot of living organisms. It's a lot of things kind of pushing and pulling on one another. It's a lot of things reading and interpreting the signs of other things and like passing those signs on to other things, in this really interesting way, right? And and maybe there's an intelligence there. I think that's really a really interesting idea, though, that like, whatever, the wind blows in this particular way and it moves the water in this other particular way. And that for Sarah is not just an angelic annunciation, a revelation of some type of information, but it's also interpretation of another non-human being about like what's happening in the world. And I don't know, man, a lot of wild ideas. Not exactly sure what to make of them, but it's a really fun way to think about the world.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a lot of when we were talking about Willem Flusser and St. Francis a few episodes ago, where St. Francis has this kind of egalitarian left wing, Flusser called it, a left wing interpretation of creation, as opposed to Darwin, because Francis sees all of creation as being on a horizontal plane. He's in this sibling relationship with all of creation. Whereas for Darwin, there's this story of the lesser kind of getting subsumed by the better and better and better, ending with humanity as the top of creation, this kind of vertical path. And I feel like I mean, maybe it's just because we've been talking about St. Francis for weeks on this podcast, and I guess we're doing it again on accident, but I can't help but read a kind of Franciscan spirit into that idea as well, that, brother sun and sister moon, there's this kind of sense in which everything is expressing something. Everything has some kind of intelligence to it, depending on how we want to restrict that kind of definition. And that's the thing I like most about Michel Serres. He's just like not concerned with nailing down all the categories exactly right. He just wants to say like, well, what if we did sort of think of this way? Where would that get us? And he's kind of willing to take you there. And the fact that it's done in a dialogue form, I think really assists that. You can sort of allow the associations that come to you to sort of play with the text, because it's not an argument per se. It's just like a series of a series of impressions that are leading you down a path, and that path being like, yeah, what if big wind currents are also angels and also intelligent in some kind of way, and bear some kind of message for those of us who are able to hear it. I think there's some kind of resonance there with what we've even been talking about with St. Francis.
Totally. It's like there's one level in which this is just like a fun and sort of like interesting meditative practice, I think, maybe to think about the world in this different way. But I think there's another level where it's actually extremely important, as we are, already kind of down the path of climate catastrophe. There's something about this that is fundamentally like subjectively different, like that will, if you take it very seriously, if you think about it in this, like, I think the way that you're taking it right now, Dean, like Franciscan way, it sets you on a different path to live a different type of life if you really, are consumed by it in a good way. So I don't know. But this is hinging on, I think, His this is hinging on Michel Serres' big like philosophical idea that I think comes out in this book and comes out in basically every book he writes. Philosophers, they usually have one good idea, and Michel Serres, he's no exception. He has one good idea that he gets to express in a whole lot of different books, and I think it's great. So
I'd love to have one.
I would love to have one great idea. I don't think I'm probably going to. I think as close as I'm ever going to get is reading other people's good ideas, and that's fine. But for Serres, his one good philosophical idea, the one that he uses again and again and thinks is like really worth kind of figuring out, is interesting. It is called the quasi-object and sometimes the quasi-subject. So in philosophy, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to talk about this, and Dean, maybe you can like help me expand a bit more here. But in philosophy, and in philosophy and in grammar and everything, right? We think of things in terms of objects and subjects, right? A subject is not an object. You're playing a game of ball, right? And usually we think of us, the players, as subjects to the object or something. Sometimes we can mix that around in different ways depending on which philosopher you're talking to. There's a huge conversation going on about subjects and objects and how they relate to one another. But usually when we talk about objects and subjects, I keep switching them up for whatever reason. Humans are at the center of the equation. Like when you're watching football, you're watching not the ball, you're watching the people play, right? That's the kind of idea. But Michel Serres has some different ideas with the quasi-object. I'm going to read this bit here, and we'll talk about it and maybe like what it means. But this is where like the weird French part of it all kind of comes into question. So in this example I'm going to read here, Michel Serres is talking about, he uses the word ferret, but he uses the French word, which I'm not going to try to say. And just up front, let me tell you, in the footnote, a kind translator has said this: the ferret is the animal, but it's also the well-known marker in a game somewhat like Hunt the Slipper or Who's Got the Button. So when he uses the word ferret, he's using it in this sense. It's part of a game where you're passing around something. I guess French people, they love this. They love this thing. I have no idea. Anyways, an important translator's note before we get into it. Okay, so I'm going to read the philosophical part here and we'll figure it out. The quasi-object is not an object, but it is one nevertheless, since it is not a subject. Since it is in the world, it is also a quasi-subject, since it marks or designates a subject who, without it, would not be a subject. This is all very confusing. He who is not discovered with the ferret in his hand is anonymous, part of a monotonous chain where he remains undistinguished. He is not an individual. He is not recognized, discovered, or cut. He is of the chain and in the chain. He runs like the ferret in the collective. The thread in his hands is our simple relation. The absence of the ferret, its path makes our indivision. And then who are we? Those who pass the ferret, those who don't have it. This quasi-object, when being passed, makes the collective. If it stops, it makes the individual. If he is discovered, he's it. Who is the subject? Who is an I? Who am I? The moving ferret weaves the we, the collective. If it stops, it marks the I. So imagine this for a hot second.
I'm trying.
You're
so
playing
hard.
Duck Duck Goose. I'm going to translate this into an American parlance. You're playing
Great.
Duck Duck Goose, right? And you're in the circle with all your friends, and someone is walking around saying duck, 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 right? And in that moment, the person who is it, right? They're weaving the group together. They're the one who is creating the collective of the organization, and everyone else is just like in the mix. And when someone says goose, they become a person. They become it. They become like the person who is like subjectified in the moment. And then that's how it works, right? But if you're not picked, who are you in that game? You're nobody. You're just one duck among any. Here's another example. Jesus. So Sarah goes on to say this: a ball is not an ordinary object, for it is what it is only if a subject holds it. Over there on the ground, it's nothing. It's stupid. It has no meaning, no function, no value. Ball is played alone. Those who hog the ball are bad players, and they're soon excluded from the game. They're said to be selfish. The collective game doesn't need persons, people out for themselves. In this example, I don't know, you're playing a game of ball, you're passing it around to each other, whatever. You're playing soccer, you're playing football, you're playing basketball. It does not matter. But the idea here is that, like, you think you're watching the game, you're playing the game, and you think the game is about you, but the game is about the ball. Because if the ball wasn't there, you wouldn't be drawn into the collective. You wouldn't be drawn into the assemblage of people playing the game. And this is all like, it seems like maybe some silly semantics, some silliness for sure. I think it is silly, and maybe that's also why it's so interesting. But there's something true about it, because not only are games of ball or who's got the ferret, whatever, drawing people into the collective, but all kinds of other things are drawing people into the collective. We live in a world of quasi objects and quasi subjects, things that are not quite as inert and dead and stupid as we think, but actually have some kind of information to convey, or who draw us into particular relationships, who define our identity as individuals or as species, and so on. So there's a bigger picture here that Sarah is trying to construct, right? The language is complicated because he's trying to draw out something that is extremely big and vague, right? Like, how do you find your identity within a large system like the Earth or something? How do you find, like, how you fit in that? And it's through these types of games, or these relationships that we're drawn into from other actors that we don't even think about as, like, particularly interesting or bearing intelligence or bearing a type of, like, even worth in the world. So we're drawn into things by all of these non-human things in the world.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, it might be hard to get your head around, but it's a good contribution from Sarah, mostly because it does challenge that anthropocentrism that we all kind of have in Western capitalist societies, that humans are really the only important actors in the world. I mean, our society is organized in that way. That's why capitalism is destroying the whole planet, because our need for a bunch of minion Funko Pops or whatever is actively outstripping all the other kinds of forms of messages, all the other kinds of objects, subjects, quasi-objects, or whatever that are around us that actually make our lives possible, that not only draw us into a collective socially, but draw us into, like, the means of life at
Right.
all. And I think that's something that I appreciate about Sarah too, that he's trying to expand our identity to see that we're pretty porous people, porous creatures. We're held up by our relationships to other stuff. Nobody is kind of shut up within themselves. You're always taking in things from the environment and also giving things back to the environment, good and bad in both directions. So I feel like that's an important thing that we really can't remind ourselves enough of, as the planet. Every day you're, like, assaulted with messages that try to prevent you from, I don't know, broadening your horizon of care or concern beyond your own consumptive needs.
Here's one more example from Michel Serres' expansive and extremely weird work. He has a really short book that's called Malfeasance, and it's a book about private property and how humans, like, exercise property over something. And it's really interesting because it's a type of economic reading of property that I think you'll not find anywhere else, because it's not really about labor, it's not really about capital. It's instead about this this extremely, like, animalistic human thing that people do to mark property through pollution, through spoiling, through, like, excrement and stuff. Which sounds bizarre on the front end, but Michel Serres makes a pretty good case that, like, the way that humans come to possess land is by, like, making that land or that thing unusable by other creatures, by, like, pushing everything out, right? So, like, for example, if somebody wants to say they own a plot of land, they will put up a big fence and make sure that no one else can get into that fence, right? And then they'll till that land and sow it with chemicals so that nothing but, like, a particular type of crop will grow there, pushing out all of the the diverse biological little creatures and guys that live in there, so that, like, only through the dispossession of all these other types of life can a human say that they own something, right? So this is at least another example of how humans kind of throw themselves into that collective in particularly negative ways. I don't know. Again, something that's not, like, quite clear what you're supposed to do with, but I think it kind of proves the point, right? you're always drawn into a particular relationship with non-humans, but whether or not you think about that very hard is another story.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been talking about non-humans. Let's maybe close the conversation with some passages that I think stuck out to both of us, where Michel Serres talks about particular humans, or non-particular humans, I guess, as we'll see. So Michel Serres, he's talking about angels. Angels give you messages. They deliver some kind of information to you. And it might be the wind, it might be lava flows, whatever else, all these kind of non-human actors, but also humans are in the mix as angels. So in the dialogue, right, it's taking place in this airport. There are all these people that kind of come through the airport and break up the dialogue. And of course, the two people talking, it's sort of the the not so subtle implication is that they're angels to one another, right? But Michel Serres kind of gives himself a little bit of I don't know, like a chance to talk about particular people who function as angels in that space in the narrative, and then also more generally. So let me read one of the more general kind of comments. This is like an aside in the text. So Michel Serres, he's taking a political turn here, and he says, as a message bearer from the third and fourth worlds, abject destitution reveals to us a fundamental time and existence which history lessons in our country have never taught. More than the poor and the wretched, the absolutely destitute of the earth risk seeing even the seeds of humanity destroyed in them and around them by the horror of this assault. Can we say that the only true man, is the man who chooses to stand up and confront the risk of the destruction of his humanity? Yes, and he becomes so primally human that this book calls him the Archangel, in the sense of the original meaning of arche, origin, beginnings. We are all born from poverty, and to it we shall all return. So, Sarah's kind of, on a bit of a political and poetic waxing moment here, but he's trying to say something about the destitute, the absolutely destitute of the world. They not only do they kind of give us a message about the conditions of reality that, you're not taught in the history books or whatever, but also there's this sort of sense in which they're the archangels who tell you something even truer because they're closer to bare life or something. And we can problematize that in a minute, but there's something interesting there happening where Michel Serres wants to say that the very existence of certain kinds of people being on the margins of society or being utterly excluded from a system, that carries information that we sort of actively suppress in a capitalist society.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I don't know. There's so many really challenging examples of this. I mean, I don't know. You'll read all kinds of. I mean, on this podcast, we almost exclusively read philosophy about dependency theory, philosophy about the exploitation of the global South, and I mean that type of Marxist analysis is one way of getting that particular message out. It's angelic. Sorry, Marxist. But I mean, you see capitalism all the time trying to find ways to, like you just said, I don't know, suppress those types of messages, to skirt around them, to spin counter narratives, right? There's a part later on in this book where Sarah talks about like fallen angels and people who are, evil, which is a whole different thing. We're going to talk about demons a little bit later on the podcast. So if you like this angel episode, get ready for demons and the devil. It's gonna be great. But anyways, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. Like you said, though, Dean, there is a way to problematize this. Like on the one hand, there's something interesting about that people who are from the global South who are telling us about the exploitation that they face there. Or the example that comes from this book in particular is that there's an unhoused person that's in the airport that they treat medically, who they deem as angelic, and that's super interesting. That's super interesting to think of people on like the outskirts of humanity and in any way, bringing a message that is extremely human, like I want to eat, please give me a few bucks so I can do that. and the ways that people ignore those messages. And when you frame it in terms of being an angelic message, I feel like it adds an importance to it that is actually quite interesting, and that should probably evoke a lot of shame, I think, in other people for like ignoring the message. It's like it's like an angel comes to someone in the Bible and says, "Hark, let me tell you something." And the person says, "I'm not going to look at you. I'm going to keep driving past you." And there's a certain rhetorical power to that, and to framing people who are in poverty in that way, for sure. But Dean, before we started talking, you were talking about a way that's actually also, a little bit dehumanizing. So do you want to hit that one off?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, I think I understand why Michel Serres does it, and it's not just him. Like the Christian tradition does this in ways that I think can be really effective and moving, right? To see Christ in the poor, to have the poor be the kind of stand-in for Jesus, or for some narrative about, they reveal some deeper truth about us because, I don't know, they're on the margin or something. And I think that, liberation theology does it, like a lot of people that we like do it. But there's a problem with that as well, because while it tries to valorize the poor, it also kind of metabolizes the poor into a theology that makes them meaningful in a particular way that is not necessarily meaningful on the terms of the poor themselves, if that makes sense. Like, it's kind of hard to articulate, I guess, but maybe we can figure it out together. Like, not every poor person is like needs to be a symbol of like God or some deep truth of our reality for us to care about them. I think, and like also like poor people are really complicated. They sometimes they can give you, I don't know, some kind of like interesting conversation, but like to go to a poor person and assume you're going to get a pearl of wisdom is like incredibly dehumanizing, and like also turns them into objects, right? It doesn't treat them as subjects in their own right. It's like pretty disrespectful. And I think too, the way Sarah even ends this passage by saying, we're all born from poverty and to it we shall all return. Like, not exactly. Like, we're not all born from poverty in the way that like a person in the favelas of Brazil is born in poverty, right? Like, that's a qualitative difference, and we will not return to that poverty. I mean, death is the great equalizer. We'll all return to cosmic dust or whatever, but like, there are maybe experiences that we shouldn't allow our metaphysical sympathies or moments of sentimentality to like draw us too close to situations that truly are not ours. I think it's really important not to like overstate the similarity there, and also to recognize that there is like a great distance that in some cases will be like insurmountable even by our faith and theology, that like being poor is bad, like it sucks, and I think that like given the choice, probably most poor people wouldn't want to be like angels per se. They just want to I don't know, have a house or something, right? Or like be able to count on a meal or whatever. It like all the kind of poeticizing and philosophizing that happens about the poor sometimes to me just feels really like icky. It just feels, I don't know what it is. It feels kind of unfaithful to the actual experience of being around poor people, which like I said, it's not to say that just like with, maybe this is what I'm saying. Any person, poor or not, can be a sort of chance by which you could come to some new understanding about yourself in the world or God's desire in the world and so on. And to sort of give the poor a privileged space in this way, I just feel like sometimes we end up metabolizing them into something that's not quite fair. Do you get what I'm saying, Matt? I don't know. What am I missing? It feels all a little jumbled, but okay.
No, I think that's good. I mean, it's true. I think that like, there's something interesting cutting both ways. It's not like we're necessarily chastising like Serres for saying this thing or particularly saying this up rhetorically, because I think there's something to it. But I think there's also like a really important factor where if you reduce feels weird when you're talking about calling somebody an angel, but if you're like promoting somebody to that like stature, you're making them like almost responsible, or like you're holding them up as like some type of something that they might not be. Maybe this will maybe help us generate some more thoughts about it. So throughout this, like, there's like this conversation going on in the airport. We talked about that already. Um, and towards the end, oh, sorry. So there's this conversation going on in the airport, and there's an unhoused person that needs medical attention who ends up, sorry, spoiler alert, they end up dying. And the person's name, the unhoused person that dies, is named Gabriel, which is a little like, I mean, you get it, you understand like what's happening here. But there's this interesting exchange kind of at the end of this vignette where one of the people in this, like, Socratic dialogue says, "Is there a human group anywhere in the world existing without poor people?" The other person in the conversation responds, "If rich people only ever lived with rich people, how could they ever get to know humanity?" Right? And I guess like this is the rub, is like on the one hand, like people who are in poverty, their very existence announces something about the world that is really important to know. People are suffering, people are oppressed, people are purposely kept in poverty. They're kept unemployed, they're kept in low wage jobs. Like those things are all true. And people appearing before you to say that into the world is important. And rich people need to hear those things for sure, right? But also like making the making the role of an impoverished person, an oppressed person, a person kept in a low wage job, like making it their job to tell everyone the truth about the world is like setting them up to be something that like is just untenable. Like, they just want to be a regular person. They're working their shift at McDonald's and they want to go home, and like they don't have to do that, right? Like it's not their job to tell everyone, the truth of the world. People should just kind of like, I don't know, look around. But it is like,
yeah, there's a sort of like pitying moment in that as well.
yeah.
Like it's, I guess what it is, it doesn't feel like solidarity per se. I think Michel Serres is trying to do that, and I appreciate that. Like his heart's in the right place. He's trying to create some kind of real sympathy with the poor and a moment of solidarity with the poor being able to kind of, whatever, stand up for themselves or, say something deeper than whatever we learn in our day-to-day life. But like, it's not the kind of being with the poor that you get with like Paulo Freire or something like that, or even other French folks. Like, I guess, I just have a sense that other kind of theorists in this orbit, they're trying to think a little bit more on the ground where everybody's sort of on a more level playing field. With Sarah, there's, in an ironic way, by angelifying the poor, it mythologizes them out of human existence, out of like regular, I don't know, interhuman context. So it's sort of maintaining that ontological barrier between there's the poor over there and they have this special message, and then there's kind of the rest of us who are allowed to hear it every once in a while. And I think that's maybe where I'm rubbing up against.
Yeah, there's definitely some friction. It's not altogether like wrong or bad, but there is friction for sure. The other thing that's interesting though is that like, to angelify the poor feels a little bit weird in some ways, but the angelification of nature or something actually kind of feels necessary to get people to pay attention to it. And that's an interesting an interesting disconnect too, I think. I don't know. The same thing doesn't happen because of different like social mores and power differentials and so on. So I don't know. A different rub there. All that to say that the rhetoric isn't quite perfect, but interesting just the same.
Yeah, and I could be persuaded that I shouldn't be so worked up about it, but I don't know, it just hits me the wrong way on the face of it.
Since this is a podcast,
one thing that I think is,
and we do need something to talk about, I'm persuading you to be skeptical of this.
Great, I will be. I'll remain skeptical. You can tweet at me, and I may or may not tweet back at you. One thing maybe to round this conversation out, though, that I think is really interesting is Michel Serres is trying to present a way of seeing everything in the world as ultimately some kind of message bearer, right? That's the whole premise of the book, that angels are everywhere around us, even if you didn't know it, and they're all bearing messages all the time, and we have to kind of open up our eyes and hearts and minds to be able to perceive those messages. And I think there's something there that's really interesting. I think I was trying to find, like, what are maybe the analogies to what Sarah's doing, to what other people have done in history. Earlier I made this analogy to Thomas Aquinas, where Aquinas is using Aristotelian language to talk about angels. Michel Serres is using the postmodern language available to him to talk about angels. I think probably the better analogy actually is maybe somebody like Saint Augustine or something, where for Augustine, if you don't know, one of the big keys to reading him is that everything in creation is kind of a sign or symbol of God behind it. And it's supposed to kind of lead you to God. So you can learn to read the world in such a way that you're like, wow, what a beautiful creature. But it's also insufficient in all these ways. And that sort of process leads you to eventually find out the God behind all that stuff, the perfect God behind. And so it's a way of interpreting all of reality to kind of testify to the reality of God. And I feel like you actually get a kind of postmodern Augustine with Michel Serres. Like I really don't like that Augustinian way of seeing things because I think a lot of things in the world don't testify very well to God. But Michel Serres is maybe creating some other way of using that language. It's not that, I mean, Michel Serres is not trying to say like everything should lead you back to the Catholic Church in this book or something, right? He's doing something different from Augustine on that score. But he is trying to say like the world is there to be read, and like you can read it. It has some kind of legibility to it, which is also a pretty controversial thing to say in French philosophy specifically. But a very kind of interesting way of maybe seeing those Augustinian currents. I don't know, translated into a postmodern moment. And I think maybe that's what I'll go away from this book with, that Michel Serres is our weird French St. Augustine, and that's great. Glad that he's
I think that's definitely right. I mean, me as not a Catholic, or at least not yet. There's always time in the future to become Catholic, I guess, but I don't see it on my horizon. You never know. But the thing that I thought throughout this entire book was Genesis 18, because I'm Protestant, so I went right to the Bible, of course. And if you're not familiar, if you haven't done your Bible study lately, Genesis 18 is like it's a story in Genesis. So Abraham, he's camping out, I guess. He's out in the wilderness or whatever, and these three men appear at his camp, and Abraham treats them, like royalty, right? He treats them with hospitality, and surprise, those three guys were angels, they were God. Who can really say? No one's sure. But anyways, in that the I guess the important thing about that story, and like I think why it like resonates with me in regards to this book, is that like if you do think of things in this type of angelic way, it does necessitate a type of hospitality, or it should, right? Like if these things are kind of bearing messages, then it's really only like our job to see those messages, to accept them, to receive them, to try to figure them out, to be hospitable towards them, to figure out what they mean. I think that's kind of an interesting, I don't know, that's just like what I keep coming back to, right? Like how, if these things are angels, how do you be hospitable towards them? How do you like accept those messages in a way that's productive and, has that vibe of hospitality, of being open to it. I guess it is kind of like, I think pretty Franciscan too, in terms of the conversation we're having in previous weeks, but that's where my brain went to.
Yeah. I mean, there's that verse in the New Testament, maybe Hebrews or something. I don't know. I'm Catholic, so we're not allowed to read the Bible. But I think it's in Hebrews somewhere anyway, where it's about you should be hospitable to everybody because you might be entertaining angels without being aware of it, right? And there is that kind of really funny mystery in the Christian tradition. Also, Michel Serres has a great bit in here about how angels are really like rascally. He talks about how they appear and do a lot of mischievous things. They deliver messages, but they also like set Peter free from prison, and that's like a great story in the Bible. Michel Serres, like they're always kind of confounding the authorities, subverting things. And there's something to that that's really interesting too, that the angelic function isn't just to be like a boring messenger or something, but it's also to sort of tell you something that you wouldn't otherwise know, and that might kind of like rock your world, and I think that is great.
Yeah, the other part too is they talk about the wind that knocked Saul off his horse, and so that he had the conversion experience to become Paul, right? This other like revolutionary type of experience where you have a huge change in personality. That's an angelic sort of reception. I don't know. I mean, it might, I feel like where I listen to this podcast, you might feel like we're just like reaching for weird examples to connect, but honestly, this is all in the book. This is all in this book that Michel Serres has given to us. We're not reaching. We're just like kind of vibing with him. And if you think that's weird, I mean, you're right. It is weird. It's a very strange book, but it's cool. It's worth committing to and kind of getting through.
Yeah.
It's pretty short as well. It's not a hard read.
I mean, one day when we write the Zondervan Magnificast study Bible, and it is just like all of the Gospel and Sola Antiname with a handful of weird French philosophy quotes sprinkled throughout. There's definitely going to be Michel Serres in every passage of the Bible that has angels in it. It's pretty impressive how exhaustive he is with it actually being couched in a dialogue. So I don't know if you're really into that sort of thing. If you like French philosophy, if you like reading the Bible, if you like thinking about angels, if you love airports. You got to pick it up. It would be a great airplane read. That's how I should have read it. Actually, I'm gonna hold on to it. Yeah, next time I'm in an airplane, I'm bringing this book.
All right. Well, that's it for this week, folks. If you liked this conversation about angels, then good for you. I'm really excited for you. You're the exact listener we're trying to cater this whole podcast around. Next week, we're coming back with another weird philosophy book called The History of the Devil by Willem Flusser, another weird philosopher who we've talked about kind of on and off throughout the last few weeks. This week and last week, we just decided we wanted to get weird with philosophy, and we're doing it. And you're reaping the rewards. And if you want to reward us for giving you these rewards, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast, and you can subscribe there for $1 or $2 or maybe even $5 or more. But you don't have to. You don't have to do it at all. But it'd be cool if you did. If you do, you get an invite to our great Discord channel where we talk about Michel Serres. We talk about other weird French philosophy, where we talk about, I don't know, all kinds of other stuff too. We posted a lot of good memes today. I found this meme and I did post it in the chat today that said hot dogs. It said bologna is just hot dogs for people who like pancakes. I think that was extremely funny. I did cackle to myself.
It was very good. Yeah, I like that one a lot. There was also a great tweet in there from John Milbank talking about how important it is that German people sit down when they pee. What is this guy doing? So
you can't tweet. Oh my god!
You can really have your finger on the pulse of what all the theological luminaries are saying these days in that Discord for sure.
Also, some great conversations about organizing and strategy. If you are interested in that kind of thing too, when we're not posting memes, we're talking about John Milbank's pee situation. God, what a disaster. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. But you can pay us money to keep talking about it at patreon.com/themagnificast. Our music is by Maria Armstrong. The outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have